Hi, this is Paul J. Leslie on Expanding Perceptions. Today, I'm so happy to be talking to a remarkable gentleman, Tim Walter. Tim is an author, a filmmaker, an alternative life coach, and a house healer. His website is knightsrose.com, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Tim is the co-author of Spirit and Earth, a handbook for modern holistic living. He's doing a lot of really fascinating things on his own YouTube channel, which I recommend you look up Tim Walter Dowsing, Tim Walter Spirituality, whatever you need to find him, because I think he's got a lot of really interesting experiences that kind of help, maybe move our perceptions in a slightly different way. And with that being said, I want to just welcome Tim. And Tim, thanks so much for taking time out of your day and speaking with me.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's lovely to be here.
Okay.
I will just pick you up on one thing in your introduction. You called me a
Sure.
remarkable gentleman. I'm not a remarkable gentleman. One of the big things that I do, I'm at great pains to point out, is that I'm just an ordinary bloke. And that's pretty important for what we're going to talk about today.
I think you're exactly right, because let's start with this journey of being an ordinary bloke, as you in the UK say, because you were a fairly, from what I'm understanding, a fairly successful filmmaker, corporate media, working in a whole different realm of where you are now. And I was wondering if you could kind of take us on a journey from that professional life that you had to this present life that you have, that from the outside, it's so different.
It is. It's different from the inside as well. So yeah, let's go back a few years. Yeah, okay. Let's go right back to 1980. Right. Okay, that's a year to go back to. I'll try not to take too long on sort of telling this journey, but it's quite important. In 1980, I actually left school. I left school and I went to film school, which was like, film college or whatever you want to call it. Okay. Now it's important. I'm mentioning school because I hated school. Right. I recently met up with some of my old school chums, and I was really surprised by the fact that actually their perception of me was, you were a bit of a loner, Tim. You were very independent and single-minded, and I needed to be single-minded in order to actually get anywhere in the film or television business, right? So I'd gone to film school, and then I left film school 3 years later and stepped out into what I thought was going to be this amazing world of film and TV. I started work, as a lot of people do, to be honest, as a T-boy, as a runner, developed my kind of career path through the roles of director, so a second assistant director, assistant director, and then I decided that if I was going to make the leap to actually making my own programs, bearing in mind that I was working for those roles of directorship through minor commercials and pop promos and that sort of thing, the 80s being very much the pop promo era. But if I was going to do anything to sort of exercise my own directorial muscle, as it were, and the writing skills that I had, I would actually have to cross right across from that world into corporate world, into the world of corporate communications. So because I wanted to actually make my own projects, because anyway, I wanted to make my own project. So that's what I decided to do, was to become a writer, director, producer. And I went to work with a lovely lady in a very small production company in the West End of London. We did a lot of work for companies in the city, making the standard sort of corporate, I won't say standard, top end corporate training and sales promotion and all that sort of thing. It wasn't quite what I thought I was going to do when I was at film school. Ridley Scott's career was never in danger, let's put it that way. So I was there doing these very, craftsmanlike and workmanlike projects and enjoying it, but also being incredibly, incredibly stressed by the responsibility of what I was doing. I was in my mid-20s, being a producer, being responsible for tens of thousands of pounds of client money to produce a message that's got to work for that company. So I felt a lot of pressure. I stayed in that sort of arena. I changed jobs and worked for different producers, different companies as well, slightly changed things. Over the years, I worked in that sort of arena for 30 years, and towards the end of that time, I was, well, actually in the middle of that time, to be honest. It was around about the 2000s. I was working at what was the world's largest life assurance company. It's a company called Sun Life of Canada. The UK base was over here, and I was traveling some 80 miles a day each way to go and work in their offices as a production consultant. I suspect that some of your viewers are kind of nodding off by now, but basically I'm painting a picture of a corporate environment. I would be suited and booted, literally suit and tie, in I would go. We worked, I had some brilliant freelancers working for me. And we made some really lovely training programs, and I worked with some great little actors who were fantastic at bringing these things to life. They weren't, great shakes. They were just really good little training stuff, and it was a lot of fun. But I was still really, really stressed. And there was one day, adding to the stress was traveling backwards and forwards, traveling 160 odd miles round trip to the place of work was doing my head in. And there was one day where it took me an hour to travel 1 mile across the town in which I lived in the southeast of England. And I spoke to my wife, and we'd been thinking about moving. I said, look, we've got to move out here. I'm going to go mad, is basically what I said to her. So we did. We decided to move house. And we moved house from the southeast of England, as I say, sort of right on the edge of the suburbs of London, over to the Welsh borders, which is, a fair distance. It was actually about 80 miles the other direction from where my place of work was. And we moved into this lovely Georgian townhouse in a village, just in an area known as the Forest of Dean, which is right on the Welsh hills. Any of your viewership that are into television and into writers will know that actually it's the land of Dennis Potter. It's where Dennis Potter, the screenwriter, actually grew up and lived. And I thought, it's very auspicious moving to the Forest of Dean. That's Dennis Potter land. That's great. We'll go there. We moved into this massive townhouse, and it wasn't long before we realised that we were actually sharing it with a ghost. Okay, that's the only way I could describe it at the time, was there's a ghost here, because we were getting strange things happening. There were parts of the house that had not been sort of done up. They'd fallen into fairly high state of disrepair. There was even a room out the back where the previous owner of this house had directed their plumbing, the overflows from all the toilets. There were 3 toilets, 1 on each floor, and they all were directed into this room, which was a room really part of the house. And you think, well, why? What are you doing there? Why is this? So this was a terrible space, really derelict space at the back of the house. And as I found out later on, actually, some people like my mother-in-law, for example, really didn't like going in there because of the way it felt. And we had a period where light bulbs were flashing a lot. We had television trouble. We would turn the television on, it would turn itself off, and turn it on, turn it off, get it repaired, get another one. Same thing would happen. I started seeing dark shadows out of the corner of my eyes, right? So there were figures. It was literally like, well, obviously silent, just shapes moving. And because it's so fleeting and so, I'll use the word ephemeral, I did think, well, I must be imagining that. And then I just carried on. But there was one point where I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea, and I put my hand out to pick up a mug of tea, or to pick up the kettle. I can't remember what it was, but I put my hand out, and there was literally another arm just here, somebody else's arm mimicking my movement. And I literally looked at it. It was there. I mean, again, it wasn't in my inner eye. It was there, and then it disappeared. And I thought, okay, imagine that. I imagined that. I've imagined that. And then I sort of walked out. I said to my wife, I think we need to get somebody in to look at the house. We need to, there's something very odd going on here. And that coincided with having a builder around who had basically had also said the same thing. He'd said, he'd come to cost up some work, I think it was, and he'd come to talk to Nikki and I, and basically said, look, you've got a lovely house. Not quite sure how to tell you this, but I think you need to get it cleared. And we went, what do you mean by get it cleared? He said, well, spiritually, it's what my wife does and her friends. Oh, okay. All right. And then very near that time, I'd had this experience with seeing the arm. So we had this wonderful day where 3 ladies turned up, came walking into the hallway like the 3 witches of Macbeth. And they came with dowsing rods, with bent bits of metal. And that was the first time I'd ever seen a dowsing rod. And these 3 ladies were asking questions about, I don't know what, at the time, I didn't know what they were doing. They were standing there and speaking to themselves and quietly and they just very quickly kind of followed their rods out to this derelict room out the back of the house. And then it was like, aha, yes, of course, and then there's this big conversation as we followed them in, and the lady that was sort of in charge of them, she said, you've got a dragon line. You've got a dragon line here, and it needs some attention. It wants you to look at it. And I'm like, what the heck's a dragon line? So that process, a dragon line is an earth energy line. Some people know them as ley lines. We might talk about that a bit later on. But that process, that experience opened up a whole side to my reality, and we'll maybe touch on why I call it my reality, in a way that I really just thought, well, why have I never seen any of this before? Why have I never been aware of any of this side of reality before? Because it opened up the fact that there was the earth energy line, ley line, brackets, the fact that there was a guardian aspect there, a guardian personality like you or I, but just not visible. And that was the ghost. And she had been gently trying to get our attention because, as she said, she just wanted to be part of the family. That's the ghost speaking. She literally, that was the first thing she said was, I just want to be part of the family. And we were communicating with her with the dowsing rods. So you can hold rods and you can get a response, and you can, if you're at all kind of sensitive, you can sort of hear a process as well and get feelings about it. So this experience introduced me to the whole aspect of what I now refer to as the subtle realms, and the fact that there are personalities throughout the subtle realms that can be spoken to, and most of them are absolutely amazing. And where it's taken me, I'm going to jump a couple of decades here to the present day, because where we are now is that what I do for a living is I'm a house healer, an alternative life coach. That's my description that I use on my YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is about what I do, but it's about giving people the tools to try this sort of stuff for themselves. So to try dowsing for themselves and see where it takes them, to show them a door to this aspect of reality and allow them to push it open, and then they're going to have a whole load of questions. But what I do for people on a client basis is I operate as a house healer, which means that we're actually working on the subtle energies of the space in which the person lives. And we're working with the individual's energy field, the personal energy field of the individual, in order to help them through whatever situation it is that they're presenting to me with. So, they're coming to me with problems in the same way as you all have clients coming to you with for issues and for work. And a lot of what I do, part of what I do is actually based on a talking cure as well, which is why I call myself that alternative life coach, because a lot of what I find I'm doing is helping them to shift their perspective on their experience of the subtle realms from being one of fear to being one of, oh, I see, I understand other people experience this, do they? And then, I see it as my role to sometimes help them see how they can walk down that path if that's where they want to go. Or we just, communicate with those in the subtle realms and explain that actually there are effects that are coming from them that the individual on the human side just isn't comfortable with, and so we move them on in that sense. But it's all a case of sort of diplomacy and negotiation most of the time. We could talk about how it's done in a minute if you like. I don't know. I feel as though I should shut up and let you kind of pick up some of that.
No, that's Tim, that's great, because it's just what a big shift, not just in how you see the world, but also in a career, because for a lot of people, looking at the more materialistic thing, it would probably have been a better decision to stay in London, do the commute, make the money, and all of this. So there was such a change, just not only economically, professionally, certainly spiritually, emotionally. I find that fascinating. Now, as you were making this transition, after you've had these experiences that are totally new to you in your life at the house, did you have any sense, as things were kind of opening your perceptions, that you were actually on a mission that has kind of been laid out for you, or do you feel like this is just happenstance?
That's a really nice question. Really good question. One of the things I will point out is that change, that whole arc of the development from corporate stress to not corporate stress, of a different level, it took a long time. Okay, so the decision to move was an easy one because we were both feeling the pressure of the Southeast. That's great. I will answer your question in a sec. That was an easy one. The revelation of the ghost being present, and her name was Jane, and she stayed in the house. We were with her for more or less for 15 years. We lived in that house 15 years. Yeah, it was 15 years. So there was 15 years of development and change in that process. And actually, you've put your finger on the button in terms of financial material world, because actually what happened was that the more I got involved and fascinated by let's call it the spiritual world, then the less I was interested in making the corporate programs. And what happened was I ended up doing more conferences, and that was a very different sort of beast, but even more stress. But I went from that because, do you know what's really interesting? Was there a hand of another force involved, which is the essence of your question? And this is an example of, well, have a think about this. I was doing the conferences for Sun Life of Canada. Sun Life of Canada was 80% of my income. I was earning a very pleasant amount of money, thank you very much, and was traveling the world doing these conferences. We were also starting to do a little in-house radio show. So there was a regular thing that wanted to get produced. There was a lot of work to be got through. But what this meant was that as a self-employed individual, one is always aware that cash flow is king. You need to be, you want to ride the peaks and troughs of cash flow. People that are employed, they kind of don't understand that. They don't get that, how important that is. So I'd got to a stage, because we had such a turnover of work at Sun Life of Canada, that I actually could lay out my year, and there it was. There's my cash flow. I can see it. This is the holy grail. I sat there one night at my desk working late, lights low, and thought, yeah, I've done it. The very next day, Sun Life of Canada announced that they were closing business in the UK.
Wow.
Completely. There had been not a word of it. It was announced like a bolt out of the blue. So influence from other sources, yeah, because that meant that my income went from as near as a lot. It went down by, well, I mean, you can imagine. I mean, it just disappeared overnight. So What it did was it meant that I had to find other clients. It meant that I had more free time. It meant that I could actually spend time. And I did 3 little video programs for a guy called Hamish Miller. Now, Hamish Miller was a dowser, an author, a metal worker, a spiritual mentor for many, many people. And he became a really good friend of mine for the last 7 years of his life. He wrote a book with Paul Broadhurst called The Sun and the Serpent, which is the telling of the story of discovering the ley line, earth energy lines across the southeast of England, across the south of England. Sorry, not southeast. They actually go from Cornwall across to Suffolk. There are a couple of energy lines that follow a very major alignment. It goes through Avebury, Henge. A remarkable man. And if I'd been, if I had continued my corporate standard work as it was and as it was developing, I wouldn't have had the time to spend with Hamish. And I learned so much from just being with him about dowsing and about the subtle realms. And Hamish was the one that introduced me to the idea that through focused intent, the individual can influence a space. Now, when I say the individual, I don't mean the individual human being. I actually mean the creative forces that work through us and of which we are a part can influence a space for the benefit of that space. Because Hamish had been involved with an organization called Fountain International, still exists, it still runs today. It was set up by a chap called Colin Bloy in the late 70s, I think. And it was all about gathering together as a group, focusing love into the center, the hara of a town that was troubled and affecting the vibration, the energy frequency of that town. So they did work on Brighton. And if you Google Fountain International, Brighton, Hamish Miller, Colin Bloy, you'll find reams of information about this sort of stuff. So he introduced me to the idea that actually we can affect our surroundings through that. And gently over the years, over part of this change, what's happened is that I met other people, obviously, and have refined that process to a certain extent. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing the house healing. So in summary, it's been a huge change, a huge shift, because what I've really realized is that, and we hear this from people like Joe Dispenza. Dr. Joe Dispenza is absolutely brilliant at putting this across, is that fundamentally the vibration of the heart absolutely affects your experience of reality. Now, we can say, yes, well, that's obvious, because of if you're going into a situation with an open heart and you're expecting positive vibes in return, no matter what it is, on a psychological basis, then you would say, well, yes, of course, all the biases predict that you are going to get a good response. If you're going in full of fear, then you're going to get all the fear crap, So you could say, well, yeah, that's not woo-woo. Well, actually, I don't think that what I do is woo-woo. I think what I do is actually simply connect to the subtle realms and allow that process to flow. So yeah, a scientist will say, Tim, that's woo-woo, that's nonsense, blah blah blah. Well, actually, no, it's not nonsense, because it's been the way that humanity has functioned for eons. It's just that Newtonian science decided that it wasn't a great idea. So, for whatever reason. Sorry, I've digressed somewhat.
That's more than okay, man. As I'm listening to your story, and you brought up Hamish Miller, and I remember watching a documentary about him. And in some ways, although different, you and he have a parallel kind of experience. Whereas he was owned a factory, hundreds of employees, and then he almost died, had a near-death experience that profoundly changed him. And then, this experience moved him to become a metal worker, blacksmith, and to do the kind of work that you're talking about. Fortunately, you didn't have to die, but you did have this big experience of being in a haunted house, if you will, and that started to shift. So in some ways, I can see some parallel between Hamish Miller and yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's very true, and it is really the big sort of life shift. Hamish, bless him, he was what he described as a stubborn Taurian. So he always felt that he needed something so huge that to change his life. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made those decisions. You know, he was very, very ill, which is why he was taken to hospital and had the surgery. But he said, when he was recovering, he went down to Cornwall to try and decide what he was going to do. And since the age of 8, he'd always wanted to be a blacksmith. So he thought, well, now's the time to do it. So that's what he did, yeah. So I never quite had the same. I'm not sure what I mean. Clarity, I think. Clarity. I do feel as though I have certainly bumbled from pillar to post. But thankfully, they've put the pillars and the posts there for me to bumble into. So, it's okay.
I want to ask you specifically about your work as a house healer, and you've kind of talked what brought you to that. But if somebody were to seek you out, what are the common reasons that they would seek you out for assistance with an issue for you to, kind of become involved in that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you can imagine, it varies hugely. And in fact, I was actually just doing some notes about this very thing this morning. They weren't specifically for you, but I have to admit that I thought, well, you'll probably ask that sort of question. So if you don't mind, I just refer back to this little list I've got here, because I always forget, what it's like with your clients, very well. And obviously there's client confidentiality, etc., and all of that stuff as well. But so there was a lady that I was working with recently, and her experience was very, very interesting because she was so she's a mature lady, late 50s, early 60s. She had been very successful in her career. She is suffering very badly from very serious autoimmune dysfunction, to the extent actually that she has to avoid sunlight, which is terrible. As I say, she's very bright, very intelligent, very grounded. And what she came to me for was because she was having experiences of being visited by things. And some of those things were literally climbing on her when she tried to sleep, and were basically, she was having physical manifested effects from these spiritual beings. So that was quite a dramatic one. Anyway, so what happens is that I then do dowsing. I douse the floor plan of a house. I ask upstairs to show me what the issue is and what needs to be done. There were various features that were affecting her and her family, and what happens then is that I sit in the healing stage of it and ask upstairs to do the work. We can't do it. They've got the big picture. They've also got the power of the creative force to make the changes. Those changes, fortunately, stopped the lady suffering from these physical effects. I mean, she's still got the autoimmune, but what she really wanted to get rid of was the visitations and the particular physical effects that were occurring for her, because it was horrible, clearly. So that was one, and then there are quite a few people like that, but not with the extent of actually physically feeling the bite or the sucking, right? So I did some work a little while ago for a gentleman who every autumn, actually, we're now in autumn here, but every autumn he would see what he would describe as a troll in his garden. And it only came on in the changing of the season at that time of year. He didn't like it. The troll wasn't terribly happy. So he said, well, Tim, can you do something about this, please? And it's like, well, yeah, okay, so that's fine. So we cleared that. There was a lady who had, in fact, I was approached by the mother of a young lady the young lady had the eating disorder, anorexia, and she was well advanced in anorexia as well. And anorexia is a horrible thing. You probably encounter people with that. It's a really horrible thing. Bless them. Now that one was not quite such a great easy. The other two weren't easy, but it wasn't quite such a simple, straightforward success story. In as much as this one did teach me about the fact that we have to trust what the management do when they change things. So we were talking earlier on in our chat about the fact that, you know, suddenly things can change in life, and it means that you've got to really react and change things big time. Well, for this particular girl, I mean, she was a girl, she was late teens. She actually had a near-death experience. So her anorexia took her right to the edge, and she basically was rushed to hospital. She was dying. Now, parents in that instance, quite understandably, said, "Tim, this has never happened. We've never had anything like this before. Sorry, let's not do any more." You know, fortunately, the girl came round again, and but I'm convinced that she had that near-death experience, and that will have changed her life. You know, it would have been lovely. It would be great if I could sit here and say, well, yes, you know, I continue to do work with them, and she's absolutely wonderful and doing blah, blah, blah. I can't finish the story on that one. But I'm giving you that example because it is not just about, you know, this is not fluffy. This is not fluffy and everything's wonderful. And it's not just sit down and flick your fingers and something's changed. These are very real energies, and they do have a very real effect when we connect. You know, even though we're doing it with compassion through the heart, we don't know what's required to change. Upstairs appears to know what is required for change, and they do appear to follow some kind of blueprint and some kind of plan, but sometimes it does mean that the client's world is turned absolutely upside down, you know, very quickly. So it can be a bit scary, but you learn as a house healer to trust and to assist the client through those points of change. And I'm sure that your work is actually very, very similar.
I think in some ways, yeah. It doesn't sound as exotic as yours, I'm afraid, at this point, but it's very good. I want to ask you, because when you were doing those stories, a question pops in my mind about how your views of interaction with nature has changed back from when you're sitting in a traffic jam outside London. How have you, with these kind of cases that you work, and how have those changed over the years?
Well, I 100% I 100% believe and feel that the external environment is well, spiritually they call it the illusory environment, you know, generated from within. It's a part of us. So I believe that it's a part of us. I feel connected to nature. I'm staring out the window, which is why I'm going over in that direction. But I'm looking at the fir trees. I'm looking at the garden. You know, I live in an area of the UK called the Yorkshire Dales, which is a national park. So I'm very lucky to live in a very wild place. Actually, we get cut off easily in winter and all this sort of thing. So. The external environment, and not only nature, but you know, I mean, well, it is nature, because actually human beings are a part of nature, and we forget that, and we don't refer to ourselves as being part of nature. But our external reality is really the reflection of what is driven from within. I really believe that now. And so sitting on the M25, the motorway that goes around London, for hours on end, as I used to do, it's a very different experience, as you say. If I was talking to a client now, I would be looking at aspects of their world. In fact, I do consider that in fact, this is what I teach. I teach the house healing through a 10-month training course now for people that are interested in doing it. And what we look at is the way that actually you treat the client as an individual who has their entire own universe. So I really do consider that, you have your own universe on so many different layers, as I do. And right now, we have an interaction of those two universes. Now, what I mean by that is that all of the rules of your universe, they obviously reflect mine to a certain extent, because we're sharing this conversation. We're able to have this. We're resonating at a similar frequency with many aspects of it. But there'll be many aspects of your universe, your experience of the world, of being a human being, of being a spiritual being or not. I don't know what your spiritual practice is, but that will be slightly different to what mine is. And all of those beliefs rack up to create our overall experience of reality. And not only our experience of what goes on out there, but also, of course, it's driven by what we think of ourselves and how we hold ourselves and how we present ourselves and who we think we are and who do we think we are and what are we, and so really fundamentally the biggest change in my life is to actually have a recognition that I am not what I thought I was 30 years ago. There's no way that a human being is simply, yes, you get up and you do the, blah, 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 blah. All those things that we're taught to do in school. A human being is absolutely a spiritual being as far as I'm concerned. I 100% accept that there is an essence of me that is within the biocontainment suit, and the reality structure in which I am experiencing things and traveling through my life is an amazing creation by forces that we have no idea about, but we will call God or the universe or whatever. And it's an extraordinary connection when you realize that actually the spiritual being, the subjective experience, the thing that experiences every moment, that forms each second, that forms each minute, that forms each hour, blah, 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 will always be there. Because if it isn't, you'll never know. So there is no such thing as death. If we think, we were talking about Jeff Mishlove earlier on and his wonderful sort of pursuit of, yes, life is, it's eternal. Well, yeah, absolutely. Because it is, isn't it? The subjective experience is so powerful, and that's fundamentally where I'm operating from in all of this work.
I think this is a great example of the term paradigm shift for you. And I think for a lot of people who experience that, but what's kind of jumping out at me is for this to be a somewhat smooth transition, if there is such a thing capable, there has to be an element of trust in the process. Do you find that to be true?
Oh, absolutely, Paul. I mean, one of the things I didn't say actually was as my wife and I were coming to terms with the fact that we were living with a ghost, and there were such things as ghosts. I mean, bless her, she wasn't really a ghost. She was a guardian, and to give her due respect, that these guardians are very important. But mind you, she always told me not to be so serious. So I got to be light about it. But as we were coming to terms with this stuff, I particularly was feeling like, I think, every now and again I was thinking, I think I'm going mad. I think. And I used to have anxiety attacks at that time. And some of those were based on, I think I'm really losing the plot, So there was an aspect of real insecurity and uncertainty about that whole period of change. But, and again, you can look at the hand of other forces being at play here, because at the same time as we were moving in there and discovering Jane, and life was starting to change, my brother, who was 2 years older than me, he actually was undergoing basically a nervous breakdown. He went full on into psychosis. He was sectioned under the Mental Health Act. And so I could look at Steve and say, yeah, I can see that he's having trouble, and that he's also experiencing some of the things that I appear to be experiencing, but I'm not lost in it like he was briefly. temporarily. He was in the end diagnosed as bipolar and blah, etc. Right? So you know exactly where that goes. So the fact that he was having this horror enabled me to stay sane to some extent. It wasn't just that, but that was there. And I have to say, I do feel, and I mentioned this in the book, that actually I think that there was an agreement made before he and I came down to this plane, that actually he would go through that because it would really support me, which it did. So the essence of your question is that no, I mean, a spiritual awakening, as that's what we're talking about, can be incredibly unsettling, because the paradigm shift means that basically somebody says, well, you thought your reality was this, well, we're taking that away now and we're putting that one in. How does that feel? And it's like going to the optician saying, well, is that better or is that worse? Is that better? No, that's a lot worse. That's like, what are you doing? Right? Because it's that process, because the universe, we can only react to what the universe presents to us. And that's exactly it. It's, I'll take an action, the universe will take an action. I'll take an action in response to that, and they'll react. Action, reaction, action, reaction all the time for each one of us. And this is the essence of that ability to step back and be detached from your own mind experience and do it mindfully, is to recognize that your choices are in each of those moments and each of those decisions that you make in response to what you're being presented with. So for me, that was an easy analogy. I hope I've made that clear as to what I'm talking about there. Action, reaction is in relation to us individually and the universe presenting itself to us. For me, it was easy because in my role as editor of putting together videos and things, and storytelling, which is what we learned about at film school, and subsequently, all of those years of trying to get work into broadcasters and all the rest of it, you understand about story. Action, reaction is the essence of editing in a drama where you've got two characters. So it was easy for me to understand that. And now what I see, and really now I'm, on the YouTube channel, I talk about this a lot. I'm starting to talk about this more. Is I think it's really important that we put people in the position where they can understand that they are in charge of their own stories. They're in charge of their own lives, and only them, in charge of their own lives, their own stories. And if they want to follow a story that is one of pain and suffering, then actually, to a large extent, now I'm not saying this applies to absolutely every situation, and I could be accused of being really, broad brush, sweeping statements here. But fundamentally, the essence is that we have to be responsible for our own choices and the way that we react to what we are presented with, whether that be through a person or a situation. Okay, so the essence of this. And I do get a bit passionate about it because the essence of this is really important, that we are the story and the storyteller. And in terms of the quantum physics of this, and science knows a lot about quantum mechanics and quantum theory, and although there are various iterations of it, the fact is that the current thinking is that we absolutely do project our world out there. This is science. This is where the science is. And so it's not new age woo-woo to say that actually the importance is your choices of what you believe. So when we're faced with a barrage of complete nonsense from some of the media channels, it's our choice to decide whether we align with that or not. And if we don't align with it, then we align with something that's more positive, life enhancing, and has with it, God bless, a bit of compassion.
Well, that never goes out of style, that compassion. I want to kind of get your thought on this. If someone were to come to you and say, Tim, I think I want to start living a magical life. Mm. What do you think? And again, I know each person's different, but what do you think in general your recommendations would be for someone who wants to embark on a path of living magically?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting term, that living magically. I know what you mean, but I would kind of put a caveat around that. If they came to me using that term and in that expression, I would say, well, actually, the magic is there all the time. The magic is there waiting to be discovered. It's not one of magic as such. You discover the magic through the joy of the experience, which is really what you're saying. What would be my advice for those people in practical terms? Well, the thing is that, I came to all of this because 3 ladies turned up one day with bent bits of wire, right? Dowsing is, I get told off by using this expression. People don't like it because they think I'm denigrating dowsing. I refer to it as being a fairly clunky way of accessing intuition, but it's actually a very effective way. And for anybody that is at all worried about the potential of accessing things that they're not, familiar with, then dowsing is the safest way. And I won't say it's the easiest way. I'm tempted to say it's the easiest way, but it's not really. But because you can get into all sorts of interesting learning situations with dowsing. But I would say, really that what you've got to focus on and encompass for that way of magical living, as you describe it, is the intuitive self, is the subjective experience and understanding that you can connect to all of that energy up there through your intuition. And this is why females traditionally have been so good at it. And perhaps, again, this might be a really outdated broad brushstroke as well, but men usually are not great, not so good. So, but because women are so intuitive, they naturally are, because I think it's part of that mothery instinct. I'm not sure I answered your question, Paul.
No, you actually did, because again, dowsing, as we talked about earlier, is this interconnection with nature and being more connected to yourself. Because if you're getting, information, one could see that as you have to know yourself well enough to be able to take what the messages you're receiving. So I think it's and if nothing else, it looks like a heck of a lot of fun. So
It is.
that's a good thing. Yeah. Well, Tim, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. So before we wrap it up, would you please talk a little bit more about where people can find you, they can find your work, how to contact you if they would like some coaching or the other services you offer?
Sure, yeah. It's www.knightsrose.com. That's KNIGHTSROSE.com. That's the website. Or they can dig me out on the YouTube channel. So again, I think you said in your intro, just pop in Tim Walter Dowser, Tim Walter House Healer into the search on YouTube, and I should show up. If you don't put the Dowser or YouTube, you'll get a German football manager, and clearly that's not me. but he must get a lot of Anyway, I'm sure he's got more followers than I have. So the YouTube channel is a great way to get in touch and to just learn stuff, especially for people, as I say, that are just kind of seeing the door and thinking, oh, can I have a peek through that? The website knightsrose.com is I'll be bringing that up to speed. It needs a bit more work, and you can dig out the book that you mentioned earlier on, Spirit and Earth: The Handbook for Modern Holistic Living, which I co-wrote with my colleague and friend Adrian Ingleton-Weber. That gives a sort of a taster of some of the house healing sort of interactions that we do, but also very much is about what we've been talking about today, which is really a simple, practical spirituality.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with me, and maybe this is something we can do another visit in the future.
Absolutely, I'd love to. Thank you very much for being so gentle with me.
Oh, well, it was easy, my friend. Thank you so much.
You made it very easy. Thanks.